If you find yourself wondering why the show is called Intractable, I think it'll only take you a few minutes to understand why. In early December of 2017, towards the beginning of our reporting process for this podcast, I sat down with Yael Lavie, a veteran broadcast journalist who has written, spoken, and reported on the Middle East for more than 2 decades. Formerly a senior producer for ABC News, Yael's stories have aired from Kuwait, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. She's essentially as veteran of a reporter as they come in the Middle East. And since she's now taken a position lecturing on media ethics, I figured she would be a good person to turn to for advice. I had, essentially, one question. How the hell do you tell the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the longest-running, most divisive, and most complex political situations in the world? Here's what she had to say.
The sad thing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I'm speaking now as somebody who's worked in mainstream media for the last 23 years, is that nobody cares about it anymore. What's sad to me about it is that that's the type of conflict that needs as much media as possible. Mostly it needs a third party to step in and put the two sides together, which usually comes from a lot of information pumped in the media. But, it's hard for me to even call it a conflict. It's almost like a fait accompli. It's not a conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian status quo.
As you can imagine, not exactly what I was hoping she'd say. But later that very week, Trump did what Trump does best. He kicked up some dust where it had, just moments prior, seemed to be settling.
I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I've judged this course of action to be in the best interests of the United States of America and the pursuit of peace between Israel and the Palestinians.
And boy, oh boy, did peace follow.
At least 4 people were killed in the latest round of violence engulfing the Middle East. Security is on high alert in Bethlehem this morning as violent clashes have erupted in the West Bank and Israel since President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the Israeli capital.
So maybe it's not the sexiest story these days. Maybe, as Yael suggested, in the post-9/11, post-ISIS world, we've become so blinded by the violence we see in the media that a nearly century-long conflict looks almost normal. But here's the thing I can't get off my mind. For the 200 people who were injured and the 4 Palestinians who died in the rioting and protests following Trump's announcement, for the Israeli security guard in Jerusalem who was stabbed at his workplace that same week, for the people who pass through checkpoints daily, for those who've had loved ones who died during their army service in the Israel Defense Forces, or just in bus bombings on their way to work, for those who've had their homes raided, their businesses limited, or their education stunted because of this conflict. For them, the conflict is kind of just another word for life. For them, the conflict matters. A lot. In this podcast, we're going to take a look at the situation head on. In each episode, we'll take a deep dive into one subtopic related to life in this so-called conflict zone. And just like the place itself, it's going to be a wild, weird adventure. And it starts now. Today we'll take a step back from the most recent headlines, because in order to understand this conflict, you need to understand how it all began. Now, I should go ahead and acknowledge that our story today is a difficult one to tell, in part because it's a story that contains many tragedies, both small and large, but also because, as you might imagine, each moment of this story can, in one way or another, be picked apart and made political, and it often is. So let's cover a little bit about me, your host, because if you already have an opinion on this conflict, as many of you probably do, there's a good chance you're wondering what my angle is. If you call yourself pro-Israel, you're wondering if I'm a liberal American boycotter. If you call yourself pro-Palestine, perhaps you're wondering if I'm some deep-cover Israeli operative trying to whitewash the occupation. Unfortunately, or in my opinion, fortunately, I'm going to have to disappoint both of these groups and tell you that I'm neither of these things. For the sake of transparency, however, a few quick things about me. I'm not Jewish, I'm not Muslim, and I'm not even really Christian, although I did grow up in Texas, which definitely counts for something. What I'm trying to say is I didn't grow up with this conflict. I wasn't taught anything about it as a kid. Honestly, I didn't even know why the West Bank was in the east of the country, let alone what it was the West Bank of. For the record, in case any of you were wondering, that would be the Jordan River. All I used to know about this place was that it was complicated, and for some reason, people's ability to have calm, rational, empathetic discussions about it was, a bit lacking. What we usually see on the news and in social media commentary are people with intense opinions. People who fall at one far end of the spectrum or its opposite. But here's what I believe. I believe in the quiet majority of people who aren't on those polar ends. I believe there's a group of people who are interested in and genuinely want to understand what's going on here, but maybe they don't know much about it yet. This is a group that also includes people who already know a lot. Maybe they live in the region, or they have family or friends from here, but they want to hear more narratives than just their own. So my goal here is not to make you pick a side, or to make the case that one group is right or that the other is wrong. I'm just a person, a journalist, and a curious outsider trying to make sense of all of this. And I'm taking you along for the ride. That just made me think of sort of the heart, I guess, of my challenge in putting together this first episode, which is that I have to sort of assume that most people who are approaching this podcast may either not know anything or may know a very, very different narrative of this history.
Right.
So
right. You got a problem, yes.
I know. That's the voice of Rashid Khalidi. He's one of the preeminent historians on this topic and works as the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. He's also sometimes considered a polarizing figure in the field, so if you find yourself bristling at his inclusion in the show, give me a few minutes. Over the course of the season, we'll talk to a lot of different people from a lot of different political backgrounds, and we'll return to Rashid's personal story in a little bit. For now, here's what he had to say when I asked him about the key moments one should understand in order to grasp the current situation. It seems like each historical action that we talk about sort of feeds into and amplifies the next one, and it's really hard to tease it apart into even, distinct periods or,
right.
Where do you choose a beginning point? So I was wondering, as far as your view of the history of the conflict goes, like, what are to you the major points of no return, I guess, like the moments that one has to understand in order to understand the political reality that we're living in right now?
Good question. Obviously, one of them is Herzl and the First Zionist Congress. So that's the first one. The second is obviously Balfour. But I personally think the 30s, what happens in the 30s is crucial. The rise of Hitler and the Palestinian revolt completely changed all the givens in Palestine. And that sort of predetermines the outcomes in 48. Partition is very important. 67 is very important.
So our story today begins in many places, at many times, and through many voices. A different historian might choose a different starting point. But since we have to pick one beginning point, and since there was no Israeli-Palestinian conflict before the idea of a modern Israel, or as Professor Khalidi said,
1897. It's crucial. The conflict begins with the beginning of political Zionism. There's no conflict before that. There's no Jewish-Muslim or Palestinian-Jewish. There's no conflict. There's nothing there. There were Christians killing Jews in Europe.
Let's dive into that. At this point in time, the land that we're talking about was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which, if you think back to your high school world history class, was a pretty powerful world force for quite some time. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, its power in the region was seriously starting to wane. It was also in the late 19th century that Jewish communities across Europe began to see long-simmering anti-Semitic sentiments become codified into law. Especially across Eastern Europe, pogroms destroyed Jewish homes, businesses, and places of worship, and the feeling began to spread within Jewish communities that they couldn't remain in Europe as an endangered minority any longer. they were too vulnerable. Thus, the birth of modern political Zionism, a movement to establish a national home for the Jewish people in the same land that had once, millennia before, been home to biblical Jewish kings. So in 1878, a small group of European Jews landed on the shores of the Ottoman Empire, in the region known as Palestine, in the hopes of carving out a safe place for their families to live, free of the persecution they saw mounting in Europe. The members of this group named the land, which they bought from a Christian Arab man named Salim Kassar, Petach Tikva, Hebrew for opening of hope. It also bears noting that even though the Jewish experience before the 20th century was almost entirely one of diaspora, there were still Jews that lived in the land that is now Israel, but they primarily lived in a handful of locations like Jerusalem, Tzfat, and Hebron, cities that had for centuries hosted populations of Jews and Muslims living side by side, and cities that would, in a matter of decades, have that coexistence put to the test. The movement started by the founders of Petach Tikva kicked off a sort of slow trickle of Jewish migration into the region. In fact, we might not even call it a trickle. It was more of a drip at first. Because as romantic as their undertaking seemed on paper, the conditions in person were harsh, to say the least. In fact, thanks to an outbreak of malaria in 1880, the original settlement of Petach Tikva was more or less abandoned by its fourth year. Still, the promise of redemption in a new place, a land where the Jewish people could reconvene and experience new life safe from the mounting dangers of Europe, was an intoxicating dream, one that began to spread in the Jewish community. At around this time, an Austro-Hungarian journalist named Theodor Herzl emerged as one of the most promising leaders of the Zionist movement. This was thanks in large part to his frenzied pursuit of support from foreign dignitaries. Herzl met with British embassy attachés, German Grand Dukes, all sorts of European leaders in high places. He even managed to be seen by the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. Basically, Herzl knew how to lobby, and he knew that if the Zionist cause was to succeed, it needed European support. So by the close of the 19th century, he decided it was time to call together the various nascent Zionist groups from across Europe. And in 1898, more than 200 Jewish delegates arrived in Basel, Switzerland, for the first Zionist Congress. Their goal was to outline a plan for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. It took several years before the Zionist movement gained any serious political traction. In fact, progress was so slow that at the Sixth Zionist Congress in 1903, Herzl proposed an entirely new idea. Progress was moving so slow on the Palestine front that a temporary autonomous Jewish state in British-held Uganda seemed like the next best plan. By a lean majority, the Congress voted to at least explore the idea. Ironically, Herzl never lived to see that the Uganda project was unnecessary. He died the next year, just before the history of all of this really started to accelerate. Now, this is where things start to get pretty messy. Just a few years prior to the end of World War I, Herzl scored big, posthumously, of course. All of his diplomatic jockeying finally paid off when, in 1917, Lord Arthur Balfour, the foreign minister of the United Kingdom, wrote to the Baron of Rothschild to say that the king's government supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people and was even willing to help achieve this goal. The timing of this, of course, was key. After World War I, the lands of the former Ottoman Empire were divided up between European powers. This meant that the United Kingdom came into possession of the lands that are now Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. And this meant that Balfour's declaration came home to roost. The next 30 years or so are a whirlwind of activity. Movement building, migration, national consciousness raising, stuff that's almost impossible to tease apart into individual moments and characters. World War II begins, the Holocaust occurs, waves of Jewish immigrants arrive, local Arab leaders call for national movements, Arabs massacre Jews at Hebron, Jews retaliate against Arabs, tensions rise at the holiest of religious sites in Jerusalem, Jewish and Arab militias begin to form and to arm themselves. And if this history isn't making you dizzy, then good for you. But the point is, at this time, so much is happening. And the worst part is that as both of these national movements are forming, Palestinian, Arab, and Jewish Zionist, each hoping to gain control of the entirety of the British Mandate, neither of them really recognizes the other as a present, legitimate political movement.
The national movements are there. They're nascent in the sense that, they're not yet hegemonic. They have not yet established their nation state.
That's our friend Rashid Khalidi from before.
But they're there. The Palestinian national movement, there's a huge documentation on the Palestinian national movement in the 20s and the 30s. There's an Israeli historian, Yehoshua Porat. He's got 2 volumes. There's multiple things in Arabic. I can't even tell you how much interesting stuff there is. So they're both there in the 20s and the 30s. The only difference is the Zionists don't recognize the Palestinians are there, and the Palestinians don't recognize the Zionists as a national movement. But they're there. That doesn't matter.
Yeah, so they're sort of like looking past one another in a way.
Yeah, of course. They always have.
Yeah. In short, it's a mess. And within this knotted up, confusing history, there's a certain aspect of blindness for the other that starts to take control. Both sides of this conflict lay claim to the land. Both sides possess generations of tragedy and pain, and yet neither side can truly see the other's narrative as true. This sets the tone for almost every catastrophe that is to come from here on out. So, before we go any further, let's pause for a moment and take a quick breather. It's almost as if, you can use one word or its counterpart and completely
martyr versus terrorist,
close people's ears off to something.
Yeah.
How do you navigate that?
Wow.
That's the voice of Yael Lavie again. You might remember her from the beginning of the show when she told me that nobody cares about the conflict anymore.
Look, how do you navigate the terminology? You're always going to have that. I don't think we should... Look, I accept the fact, this is a very harsh thing to say, I accept the fact that one person's terrorist is another person's martyr. I couldn't say that on the air for certain networks I worked for. Okay, I accept it. I don't agree with it, but I can understand that. And if we learn how to explain that to our viewers, users, no matter what nationality they're in, that we stand a chance. My father was part of the underground movements in Palestine under the British rule. Okay, they blew up railroad stations of the Brits. They were considered terrorists. But for their brothers in the Haganah, they were freedom fighters. Because as Peter Jennings said, in the Middle East, whenever you pick up a coin, you want to instinctively flip it over because it's completely different on the other side. And that you learn when you grow up here.
What Yael said is true. The relationship between the British authorities and the inhabitants of Mandate-era Palestine was not exactly what you'd call peachy. The Balfour Declaration didn't mean that Jewish and British men and women were skipping around holding hands. Israeli militias did blow up quite a few British landmarks and resources. Some of them even went so far as to blow up buildings, like the King David Hotel bombing of 1946. That attack, which was perpetrated by the Irgun, killed 91 people. But even attacks by Israeli militias that didn't end in any human cost still led the British authorities to call the Israelis terrorists. Take this historical recording, for example.
In Palestine, terrorists strike again. The petrol storage installation at Haifa was set on fire. Damage and loss is estimated at £350,000. The Palestine government has stated that the cost of the outrage must be borne by the Jewish community.
So, even though our definition of terrorism has certainly strengthened over the years, I think what Yael said is pretty crucial to understanding people misunderstanding the history of all of this. It's almost like you're trying to separate two helixes of DNA. Each moment on one side, the Israeli side, maps directly onto an equal and opposite one on the other. Every political gain for the first side is a loss for the second. Every victory for one is a dispossession for the other. Like Yael said, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And it's impossible sometimes to wrap your head around the diametric realities that exist in this story. So I'd actually like to pause our rapid march through time here and jump forward a tiny bit. I know we're skipping a lot of juicy historical stuff, but We've just reached two of the most crucial moments in the making of this so-called Israeli-Palestinian status quo. Both occurred in 1948, and in many ways, the two events act as mirror images of one another. The first is the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, a cause for celebration on the part of the British, who were more than eager to be rid of the increasingly troublesome stretch of land.
The Palestine Mandate is ended, Britain is relieved of a burden. 10 weeks more are required for complete withdrawal. With the end of the mandatory power, all legal bars to immigration are removed. The seas are now open to the seekers of the Promised Land.
Many of those seekers of the Promised Land were boats full of Holocaust survivors, men, women, and children who narrowly escaped the slaughter that laid claim to the lives of around 5 to 6 million Jews. This recording from the mid-1940s, just before the moment we're discussing, is a ship of Holocaust survivors on their way to the British Mandate. The song they're singing is Hatikva, the song that would later be adopted as the Israeli national anthem, a song whose title means the hope. The other event we'll be talking about that took place in 1948 is something far less hopeful. And to tell the story of these two intertwined moments, I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine.
Look, usually people who come to study Middle East studies or Palestinian history, they want to study Palestinian history.
This is Hillel Cohen. He's a professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies and the director of the Cherrick Center for the Study of Zionism at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's also the author of Year Zero of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1929, which is the book that led me to him.
But what I tell them is at the beginning of every year, sometimes I have to repeat it, that what I tell them is that they should not accept neither my analysis, but also not the Palestinian narrative. They do not have to accept it. They have to study it, to understand it, to understand that other people think differently. I say, look, each of you, if he or she would have born in Askar or Balata or Shaja'iyya refugee camp, would have believed in the Palestinian narrative. So it's a matter of, coincidence.
Hillel's work is special to me for many reasons, but primarily it's because he inhabits this exact problem I was talking about before, the inseparable but completely contradictory natures of these two narratives. And it's something he seems to do with ease.
Some people can accept it, some people cannot accept it. This is usually it. But I say, okay, for 90 minutes now in the class, forget that you are Israeli Zionists. Try to forget it. It is impossible. I do not forget it. You wouldn't forget it. But when you hear an argument according to Palestinian narrative or whatever, don't start to think why it is wrong and how to reply to it. Think why it is right. When you think why it is right, it doesn't mean that you have to accept it.
As it turns out, Hillel's ability to take this view stems in large part from an early experience in his life. A life so different from his current situation that it seems perhaps like a different life altogether. You see, in 1978, when Hillel was about 15 years old, he quit school and joined a yeshiva in the West Bank settlement of Beit El. He came from a religious family, and in a quest for something new, something less boring, he says, than his teenage life in Jerusalem, he went in search of a story. Beit El, the Jewish settlement where Hillel lived at the time, was a neighbor to the Jalazun refugee camp. And one day, Hillel decided to do something pretty much unheard of, in that time or in this one. He wandered down into the camp to talk to his neighbors. The people of the camp were mostly confused at first, and word spread quickly that there was a young Jewish boy from the settlement walking around and asking questions. The funny thing was, Hillel wasn't so unlike the refugees at the camp. Or at least, he didn't look so different. Even though he was Jewish, Hillel's family was what some would call Arab. Like many Middle Eastern Jews, his father had been pressured to leave his home in Afghanistan when Israel declared statehood. moving to the new country in a massive wave of migration from other countries in the region. Hillel spoke some Arabic and picked up more as he spoke to the Palestinians in Jalazun, but he was surprised most of all by what they had to say about the history he thought he knew.
What was very new and surprising for me was the feeling of being betrayed by Jews. People used to tell about how they treated Jews, before Zionism. The Jews were the neighbors, they accepted them, there was no hatred between Muslims and Jews.
The residents referenced a whole long history of Jewish-Muslim relations in the land that Hillel had previously never heard of.
Some people used to talk about Muslim history, like, when Omar ibn al-Khattab occupied Jerusalem, the Muslim leader, in 640. So beforehand, the Christians did not allow Jews to live in Jerusalem. He established or re-established the Jewish community in Jerusalem. Regardless of the question whether it is accurate description of history, because of course there were better periods, less good periods in Jewish-Muslim relations throughout history, but still I think it was very dominant and very important.
What Hillel was doing by going into the camp to listen to his neighbors would have been remarkable in any period of the conflict. But this year, 1978, was something of a dark anniversary in the minds of Jalazun's residents. It was exactly 30 years after the Nakba, the most central and most painful moment in the Palestinian experience of the conflict. So, remember how earlier on in this episode I told you that the story we're telling today is a difficult one because each point can be made political? Well, the Nakba is, for whatever reason, one of the most painful but most disputed moments of the entire conflict. The history of the Nakba is actually kind of a microcosm of every problem we've run into today in telling the story of the conflict. It's two entirely different narratives, it's tragedies intertwined. It's an event that's challenging to quantify in direct numbers. In short, it's one of those major points of no return, if you recall the phrase I used earlier when speaking with Rashid Khalidi. You see, when the British Mandate ended, the United Nations put forth a partition plan. They realized, given the nascent political movements in the region, that they were dealing with two groups, Arab nationalist and Zionist, Muslim and Jew, however you want to see the split. It was obvious that the divide was there. Each group wanted the land, and so the international community proposed the age-old solution. Draw some lines on the map, and we'll fix it with some new borders. So with this problem, quote-unquote, fixed, the United Nations put it to a vote.
Afghanistan, no. Argentina, abstention. Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
In case you've heard of the term the Green Line, this is where it comes from. And to give you an idea of how artificial the separation was and is, the green of the Green Line is in reference to the color of the pen they used to literally mark it down on the map. By and large, Arab delegations refused to accept the proposal, and as British troops withdrew from the region, all-out war broke out between the newly declared state of Israel and its neighbors. Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and Transjordan all lent troops to the Palestinian cause in the hopes that the region of Palestine would be under Arab control. The Israeli forces, far outgunned and outnumbered, pulled off a shocking victory. In the path to that victory, however, lies the Nakba. Numbers are difficult to tabulate, but it's estimated that due to a variety of wartime causes, around 700,000 Palestinians were forced to flee their homes. The causes are also hard to parse. The Israeli narrative has long been that they fled because Arab leaders told them to. But one report from Shai, the Israeli military intelligence wing of the Haganah, which would be the main Israeli fighting force at the time, suggests that at least 55% of the total Palestinian exodus was caused directly by Haganah operations. An additional 15% were caused by actions of smaller Israeli paramilitary groups. According to the report, 22%, or almost a fourth of all departures, were caused directly by fear and destabilization from war. Whatever the causes, the results were undeniable. 700,000 Palestinians left their homes behind, many of them moving into refugee camps east of the Green Line, some of them fleeing further to Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, or abroad. One diaspora, the Jewish one, had gained, or, depending on how you look at it, regained a state. but in the same motion, a new diaspora was created. When Hillel heard the stories of the camp's inhabitants, he was surprised that their version of events was not the one that he had learned. The War of 1948, from his perspective, the way that all Israelis had learned it, was a war of independence. Any population movement that resulted from that was just the average course of war. What surprised him, however, was that none of the Palestinians he spoke to had any recollection of ever being in a fighting force.
When you hear the memories of ordinary people, most of them didn't participate in any fighting. If you take all the people in Palestine, the fighting forces were very small, less than 10,000 people in a population of more than 1 million.
What they did speak of was bitter departure. People who were 50 years old when Hillel wandered into Jalazun camp had been 20 when the Nakba occurred, and they remembered it clearly, telling him stories of a hurried exodus, speaking of how they decided on which most valuable belongings to carry with them and which to leave behind. Many said they expected to return home within hours, days, or weeks. Food was left on stoves to keep warm, wet laundry was hung to dry, family heirlooms were quickly buried in backyards for safekeeping. Few people ever expected their departure from home to be permanent.
One of the things, I have to say this as a historian, one of the amusing things is that just as the term Holocaust was not used for 30 years after the Holocaust, the Nakba, the term Nakba, as a common term for what happened, is coined later.
I promised you earlier that we would eventually return to the backstory of Rashid Khalidi, the Columbia professor we spoke with earlier in the show. Well, here's where his story wraps in.
We would talk about Palestine and history in my family, but the term Nakba isn't there when I'm a kid in the 50s and 60s. That's the point I'm trying to make. Today it's ubiquitous, like Holocaust. I mean, you cannot talk about history of Jewish history or Palestinian history without those two terms. It's not possible. But they weren't in use for 20 years after the event, in both cases.
Rashid's family has an interesting history, one that's tied very much to the history of the conflict. Rashid's uncle, Hussein al-Khalidi, served as the mayor of Jerusalem in the mid-1930s, back when the region was under British control. Hussein would eventually be exiled due to his involvement in the Arab nationalist movement. Rashid's father, meanwhile, Hussein's brother, was pursuing his graduate studies in the United States. He planned to return to Jerusalem with his new wife in 1948, right when the war broke out.
And then in 48 couldn't return because my grandfather's house disappeared. Well, it didn't disappear, it's actually still there. But the family had, my grandfather was forced to leave, the family was forced to leave. I had a particular view of this, which was I wasn't living in Palestine. I hadn't personally experienced the Nakba. I had not suffered in the sense that I grew up in New York City as a New Yorker. I was, an American. On the other hand, I was there because my parents couldn't be where they would have been had there not been a Nakba.
Like many people of Palestinian descent, Khalidi's entire life, from birthplace onwards, was determined by the political outcomes of the 1948 war. Now, in the interim between 1948 and 1978, when Hillel heard the stories of the refugees in Jalazun camp, refugees who were displaced by the same event that kept Khalidi's father from returning home to start a family, something really, really major happened. It's one of our last stops on this historical review, but it's one that we can't not discuss.
3 times in 19 years, Israel has gone to war with her Arab neighbors. Each time, Israel has won. But none of its victories has been as stunning as the triumph that was sealed tonight when Syria, the last of the major Arab nations actually fighting the Israelis, agreed to a ceasefire. And it is safe to say that things will never again be the same in the Middle East.
So if you're new to the history of the region, you're probably wondering, if the Israelis accepted the partition plan of the UN and then basically tried to push Arabs into their own designated partition zone, what's the problem? Well, first of all, there are lots of problems, obviously. Otherwise, this podcast would be 1 episode total and I'd get a long vacation. But one of the problems is that following another war in 1967, Israel came under control of all of the partition land and then some.
They have struck deep into the central Sinai. Their forces hold Sharm el-Sheikh, thereby opening the Straits of Tiran. They have the Gaza Strip, and to the east of Israel, they have overrun the Jordanian Bulge right to the shore of the Jordan River.
Now, in case you're not a geography buff and you don't have the entire world map well defined in your head, let me translate that for you. At the end of the war in 1967, Israel had overtaken not just Gaza and not just the West Bank, the two strips of land that were given to the Palestinians to form their state, but they had also overtaken the city of Jerusalem, which was an important religious and cultural landmark, and the entire Sinai Peninsula. Overnight, Israel had multiplied in size. If you looked at a map recently, though, you know that's not what Israel looks like today. In fact, they traded the entire Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty, one of the most successful in the Middle East. What the war did do, however, was cement the confusing, complex relationship between the State of Israel and the Palestinian territories. One thing that's important to understand about the Israeli mentality is that, especially in the period from its founding until 1967, the state felt like it was constantly on the brink of destruction. On the eve of this war, for example, Egyptian radio broadcasters taunted total liquidation of the state. And the pervading sense was that any war Israel fought was a war of life or death. And not just for its soldiers, but for the entire country. This type of existential threat meant that when Israel took the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and Gaza, many Israelis, including the youngest Holocaust survivors who were now only in their 20s and 30s, felt like it was the first time they could breathe a sigh of relief. Following the 1967 war, the roots of the extremely controversial settlement movement began to take hold. Some of it condoned by the state, some of it actively combated by the state, some of it religious, and some of it secular. Outside of the religious motivations that encouraged some people to move into the regions known biblically as Judea and Samaria, this was largely motivated by security concerns. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of the West Bank soon, but for today, let's suffice it to say that any remaining hope of a rapid peace negotiation died in this period.
There is one state in Palestine. That's the state of Israel. For the foreseeable future, there will be one state, the state of Israel. That's the status quo, and that's been the status quo essentially since '67. That's the situation. It's a dynamic situation because it's not complete. On the one hand, you have this dynamic, this status quo. On the other hand, you have this irreducible resistance of a population which will never accept, what amounts to subjugation and destruction of its national identity and its presence in Palestine. And so you have that's the conflict. That's why you do have a conflict.
If we jump forward from this point until today, we're glossing over a lot of important stuff. Namely, a few more wars and a great deal of violence. Bus bombings, rocket fire, air raids, all of the stuff that you probably remember hearing about on the news. According to Hillel, what all of this violence means is that for most people, a one-sided view of history is often the only one that makes cognitive sense. Take the current generation of 20-somethings, for example. This age group grew up during the bloody period of the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, an era marked by suicide attacks, bus bombings, and stabbings.
For them, the Palestinians or the Arabs are murderers. They just want to kill us. They do not distinguish between citizens and civilians and armed people. They have this idea in mind of killing Jews.
And it's not so different on the other side either. A few years ago, Hillel was invited to give a lecture over Skype to a group of university students in Gaza. The topic of his talk was Zionism. He settled on a few short talking points.
To tell them that the Jews came here because they have strong attachment to this land, something that many Palestinians deny. And they came here not in order to expel the Arabs or to kill the Arabs, but in order to save Jewish life and to create a Jewish Hebrew culture in this country. I thought that these 2 points would be enough.
After he gave his lecture, Hillel turned the floor over to the students for their questions.
A young Palestinian student, she said, "Excuse me, Professor Cohen, I think I know about Zionism much more than you know." Now, I am the head of the Center for Study of Zionism at the Hebrew U. And I say, okay, I would love to hear. And she says, look, everybody here in this room, someone of his family was killed by the Israeli army. And everybody here in this room is a refugee, fourth generation or third generation refugee. And our villages were occupied by Israel in 1948. So we live Zionism daily. We live Zionism daily. We are the result of Zionism. So we can tell you what Zionism is. I said, okay, you are right. I think that you cannot understand Zionism without understanding what it caused to the Palestinians. It's not that I compare 100%, but it's very similar that if your personal experience is being killed by the other, you understand that the other is a killer.
If anything's clear to you right now, it should be that the backbone of this issue is that it's cyclical in nature. The actions of one generation ripple into the reactions of the next. The inactions of one generation cause the problems of the next. That double helix image I brought up earlier, it's totally still forming. So where does that leave us today? It's hard to say. What we do know, based on polling data, is that people aren't particularly hopeful about peace right now. According to the most recent numbers from an independent survey by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, less than half of Palestinians and Israeli Jews express support for the two-state solution in principle. Most people I talk to in the day-to-day don't have a clue how this thing could reach a solution. Palestinians express frustration with feeling like the Israeli government isn't really interested in peace, that they're only interested in waiting them out until they can finish what was started in 1967. Israelis express fear of Palestinian militancy and a feeling that, however bad things are now, giving the Palestinians leeway could only lead to the violence they saw in the early 2000s. But that doesn't mean that there is no solution. According to the same survey, when respondents were offered tangible conditions, like if Israelis recognized the Nakba in exchange for Palestinians making it clear they could continue to visit their holy religious sites, almost half of the Israeli Jews opposed to two states, and about 40% of the Palestinians, said that they would change their minds. Of course, emotional possibilities and political realities are two different things, and we'll discuss later in the season whether or not a two-state solution is still possible, and what would need to happen in order for it to become a reality. For now, I'm just hoping that this incredibly dramatic British newscaster from 1948 won't be proven right forever.
Reason plays its part no longer in the affairs of this once holy city. Every corpse brought from the ruins marks vividly the future of this unhappy land, from which the steadying hand of law and justice is departing.
Support for Intractable comes from Yale University's Howland and Cohen Fellowships. Produced, edited, and recorded at IDC International Radio, Intractable is made possible with the help of IDC Herzliyah's Daniel Pearl International Journalism Institute, an organization dedicated to advancing nuance in today's reportage on the Middle East. For more information about this episode, including documents, pictures, videos, and extra audio that we couldn't fit in, check out our website at intractablepodcast.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at intractablepodcast or on Facebook at facebook.com/intractablepodcast. You can probably see a theme there, right? Send us a letter, a question, a suggestion, or a like. We love hearing back from you guys. And as one final note, like I said earlier in the episode, this is a really difficult history to tell accurately. So if you found any mistakes, let us know. Write to us via our website, and we'll give a shout out to any good corrections that come our way. Next time on Intractable, we'll be back with not one, but 2 episodes. If you recall what Yael Lavie said about there always being 2 sides to every story, well, we're going to throw ourselves right into the mix with a discussion of what it means to be Israeli and what it means to be Palestinian. For now, this is your host, Skyler Inman, and this has been Intractable.
ושיר על ארץ טובה, זיכרון מכוכב שקבע, ושוב הוא מאיר לך בלב